This is Square Pizza, cooked up by Shermco. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Square Pizza Podcast, a podcast about making the good things about school even better. I think we have another good episode for you coming up. We had the privilege of interviewing Sherrell Dorsey, founder of both ThePlug and Black Tech Charlotte, two organizations really devoted to developing Black tech talent, entrepreneurs, and creativity, really in Charlotte and Atlanta, but across the country. So a lot of good conversations in this episode. We talked about Sherrell's favorite movie, kicking off, her experience in kind of traditional public education setting, but then everything from why she doesn't own a car to what it really takes to creating space to celebrate Black technologists and entrepreneurs in the world in which we live in today. So I'm immensely grateful for her to take time. I think you guys will really get some key takeaways from this episode. You can follow her on Twitter at Sherrell_Dorsey, which we'll link in the show notes. And we'll put some more information about how you can support Sherrell and her passions in those show notes as well. So be sure to check them out. And most importantly, just want to say thanks to everyone that has given us a review, given us a ranking. We appreciate every moment you spare to just let us know what you think and supporting the show and our work. Hope you guys enjoy this one. Talk to you soon. Thanks. Sherrell, talk to me about your favorite movie, please.
My favorite movie is Rigoletto.
Tell me what that is.
So,
if I should know about it.
No, it's very obscure. I remember just watching the VHS tape when I was very young.
So this is old school.
Very old school. It's this guy was like this beast, but an amazing singer, and these kids like wandered onto his property, and this young girl, like he taught her how to sing, and through the beauty of his transformation in character, he his face and body healed, and all was well.
This is a cartoon?
Is it animated?
No, it's not.
I have an animated.
No, it's not animated. You have to look it up. I actually need to find where I can see it digitally. It was like one of my favorite movies growing up.
Who would have known?
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. All right, good people. Hello. This is the Square Pizza Podcast, where we talk about the intersection of education, innovation, and diversity. And we got super dope person here that we're honored for her to take her time. And our hand clapping sound emoji is not working today, so we're giving you the snaps. Sherrell Dorsey, ladies and gentlemen. Sherrell Dorsey, how you doing?
I'm excited. Thank you so much for the invitation to be on this new podcast project.
Always. Cool. No, it's a pleasure. So for those of you who don't know Sherrell and the great work she's doing, going to use the next 35 minutes or so to let her kind of talk about her excellence and all the great things that she is doing. But we're going to plug all the show notes, all the links, all the things for y'all to check out. But first thing is first, Miss Dorsey.
Yes.
What is it like to be Twitter famous?
Sometimes I'm Twitter famous, and it's exciting because you meet new friends and you have interesting conversations.
Yep.
And then you also get to connect with all the weirdos that you didn't know also existed and had weird thoughts. And then you have your own, you have your own little corner of the internet where you can just, fan out to random things.
But it's got to be a good market test, right? About where society is. Because I feel like Twitter keeps it much realer than in any other social media platform when you're gauging stuff like that.
It's so nuanced. Right. I think that you can have very thoughtful, meaningful insights. I learn a lot from people that I follow on Twitter. I think I've made some really meaningful connections, and even including, I think, people in Charlotte that I would have not have met personally, but got an opportunity to connect with them on Twitter. I think it can be an interesting place for discourse, but I think, sometimes that discourse can be taken out of context. And, someone who, I follow academics, particularly that study cybercultures, but I think from the social networking standpoint, and then also the awareness that comes from being online and even just following educators and news from other cities, you sort of realize you're not alone in terms of some of your rage for inequality, or even just the celebration of when you see big wins and people that are very deserving in their work to get to the next level. I think, it definitely shows you all of everything, for sure.
So you're up to 2 million followers now?
Sure. I actually started following
You heard it here first. You heard it here first.
After this podcast, I'll be there, and then maybe I can get an influencer deal.
Happy
and then,
to.
We'll all be drinking flat tummy tea. So.
Y'all go check out Sherrell in real life, but also on Twitter as well. So I think a lot of people know you for being awesome, for all the great work you're doing, but maybe not know some of your actual experience in education, in traditional education sense. Tell the people about that.
Yeah, so I actually had the privilege right before moving to Charlotte in 2014 of partaking in a public policy fellowship in the city of Bridgeport, Connecticut, as part of the Zoom Foundation hosted about 6 leaders to help try to build up, professionals that could work in the space of education. And so it gave me an opportunity and insight to work for the mayor's office at the time. That was Mayor Bill Finch. And particularly I was tasked with working under the head of youth development in education. And so I got to sort of work adjacent to some various education initiatives. At the time, there was definitely some struggle in the school system, very low literacy rates.
Even in Connecticut, which some people maybe wouldn't think may be higher achieving than what in larger urban markets.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting too is I'm from Seattle. And,
shout out to Seattle.
Yeah, shout out to Seattle, but a bubble. Seattle has its own challenges when we look at public education. But I think Bridgeport kind of pulled me out of my bubble of thinking that everyone had the exact same education experience that I had, and the exact same level of access. I sort of floated between public education and private education.
Okay.
And so going into Bridgeport was interesting. Bridgeport being the largest city in Connecticut, also one of the brownest, very Black and Latinx, also one of the poorest, higher rates of asthma, things like that, with construction of freeways right through neighborhoods, not a particularly dense population of homeowners, very, very little, if any, sort of middle class. And so you saw sort of how, and then a lot of, sort of post-industrial issues of the GEs of the world departing, the factories shutting down. So you see all this gorgeous architecture of what was a vibrant city. And I likened Bridgeport at the time to Newark. I lived in Newark for a number of years while I was an undergrad in New York City. And so you saw this just this gorgeous remnant of what probably was a bustling kind of environment and economic boomtown. And then once those factories left and you saw that sort of white flight movement leave out and more development and investment into suburbia versus the cities, and then you saw who was left, and then you saw the 80s, crack epidemic and others, now we call them opioids, but essentially just drug addiction, failing schools, no clear pathways to jobs and prosperity, lacking investment in infrastructure, blighted properties, all of these things being recipes for, corrupt government, for, a populace of employers and employment or employees who work in the city but leave to go back to the suburbs. So the sense of community essentially being thwarted. And I don't want to paint a completely negative picture of Bridgeport because...
It's a situation a lot of cities have been through or are currently experiencing, right? Making that switch to the new economy. Yeah. And bringing everybody with it.
Absolutely. And I think too, when we look at community, it was, the churches, the houses of worships, the folks starting their nonprofits and really trying to fight for progress in their communities, even if it was just opening up their centers to allow kids to come and get their homework done. You saw this community really trying to push back against severe inequality. And Bridgeport also being in Fairfield County, and Fairfield County being home to some of the top billionaires in the country.
Because when you say Connecticut, that's what I think about.
That's what I think.
Immediately. Right. And you're literally 50 feet of space.
And I've never been, to be honest.
Yeah, but I had never been before I got the fellowship and moved there, and I was I guess this is where I am. Yeah. And 50 feet of space, separating the poorest of the poor and then the richest of the rich. And so you talk about inequality, and you see, particularly within the education environment, and where I sort of had this the bubble burst, like I said, where, I'm sitting in these rooms, of organizations funded by billionaires, again, like leadership being predominantly white, the data being predominantly Black and brown, decisions being made for the future of families that are going to impact for decades, and just kind of this ongoing spiral of like, we want to be saviors, but we also don't trust people to be able to chart their own futures and pathways. The school systems are failing. I did get an opportunity during my tenure there in the city of Bridgeport to be able to witness like a STEM school being opened and starting, and even the challenges of like one city not wanting Bridgeport kids to go to school with their kids, and literally the mayor's office having to get the line moved that divide the city so that the property line was in Bridgeport and they couldn't make decisions. Yeah, absolutely. So seeing that and having to go to work every day and understand like, oh, okay, this is how like people are left back and left behind. It's intentional because instead of feeling like, okay, every city and every community is our community, it is, I want to protect what I have in my family and my community and screw everybody else that can't afford or weren't born in the right circumstances to get access. Right. I was also able to work with the Great Oaks Charter Network in bringing a Great Oaks school into Bridgeport.
Was that STEM school you mentioned, was that charter or district?
That was actually a magnet program.
Within the school district?
Cool. Within the school district. Again, you get in by lottery.
Yep.
And so, I think for I want to say 22,000 kids, it was a struggle. Some schools had
22,000 in Bridgeport.
Yeah. Yep. And I think some schools had like a 4% literacy rate.
Sure.
And so that was really hard. Also,
and probably to be clear, that 4% was African American or Latino.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
So unfortunately,
absolutely. And so there was a lot of, connectivity with folks like Teach for America. Again, I was getting a crash course in how all this worked because my background had been largely technology. And then I ended up going to school in undergrad for international trade and marketing for fashion. Yep. So I was in the business side of fashion, and as e-commerce and social media were taking over, like working more in a marketing context. Right. So to go from like that, like directly into like being yelled at, at like hearings. And
who would yell at you? Nobody would yell at you. Nobody would yell at you.
Yeah, it was very political, and it was really interesting because at the end of the day, everyone had their own approach to what education should look like. Sure. But the underlying issue just being that we are at a crisis. If our kids can't read, they're not getting to schools. I mean, just the fact that like Yale was 30 minutes away.
Yeah, that's real.
And no one, in the community could access or even know how to access. I think that for me was such an eye-opener of the challenge around education. I also got an opportunity to build out part of the mayor's youth employment program. So working with companies to bring on high school interns, paying students, whose families really did need the additional income, but providing experience. I helped to create and establish a pilot program for like the Mayor's Youth Council. Yep. So in about a 12-month period, it was a lot. Right. It was a lot. And what was great is even though I decided ultimately to move to Charlotte, and eventually worked for Uber as a marketing manager. Yep. I continued to maintain my relationships with a lot of folks who were running some of the education initiatives there. And then it also, again, it made me so much more aware about this conversation of innovation where I was super excited about like all these great tech companies making all this money and, changing the world and changing, the way we do business and changing consumer behavior and making our cities better. It helped me to understand that progress is intersectional. And as much as like, working in government can seem arduous just because like, we didn't have updated computers. I had to bring my laptop to work. Right, yeah. There's some necessity around, regulation and measurement. And I think that all of the worlds kind of can collide to solve some of our greatest challenges. And the reality is when we look at the last 30 to 40 years, and I'm sure you know this just more than I do, actually having worked in education for an extended period of time, because there's such a deficit and a deficit of resources that have not been invested, the idea of getting to the table at a tech company, passing a whiteboard test, working in a work environment where there's like ping pong and like free food, like that is such a far gone conclusion for people who every day are just trying to make sure like the rent stays paid and their kids can read. And so I think that that experience brought me back down a bit, and not in a negative way, but in a way of that, like, not everyone's journey is going to be very clear cut. And it's important and imperative that if we want to build up the next generation of tech talent or leverage the skills of people who already have deep experiences and are great managers or are great, community organizers, that those are just as significant in the new world of innovation. As well as kind of the new folks who are coming out of fancy programs and going right into six-figure jobs.
Well, I think you're right. And like even what we've seen too is like getting to those six-figure jobs or like the ping pong tables is like even the awareness of it and then like the pathway of how to, right? Because in particularly some of these schools or under-resourced neighborhoods, they're not busting at the seams with career tech programs or with coding programs. And so even just connecting the dots and clarifying the pathway is a huge jump that's not happening anywhere. So we're not even teaching our kids to dream in that way to like get them there.
It's unfortunate. Part of it really infuriates me. Like I said, I'm from Seattle.
So you've seen it, like this is real.
Well, I've lucked out because
you had Microsoft there, you had Nike.
Right. Well, so my story is that I got an opportunity to be part of a nonprofit program that got started in the '96. Retired Black Microsoft millionaire Trish Malign Zizico started the Technology Access Foundation, was a software engineer at Microsoft, like was one of the only people that looked like her, and decided like, okay, if I want to see more of the folks that look like me here, I'm going to have to build up that pipeline. Converted a storefront in Seattle's Central District, which was predominantly Black at the time. One of the neighborhoods where the grandparents, moved from the South and owned the homes there.
Wow.
Today, it is unaffordable, and you will not see a ton of Black people in that community anymore. And so it's hard to go home because people ask me, like, well, where's this, where's that? And I'm like, I couldn't tell you. The Central District is also about a 10-minute bus ride to downtown. So again, when we talk about the history of our cities and we talk about white flight and then, people wanting to move back into cities and how displacement occurs, particularly with our seniors and our elders, it is infuriating, not just because like cities change, they're supposed to, supposed to build, people are going to move, people die, people have babies, like that's naturally supposed to happen. But I was a part of a program that literally took a bunch of computers, took a bunch of brown kids in the hood, and taught us computer networking, C#, JavaScript, job interview skills. We had essay writing classes for college. We had SAT prep. This was a free program.
This was the nonprofit you were talking about from the woman that started
absolutely.
It.
Yeah. And I mean, 20 years later, it's a full-fledged academy, STEM training, all of that kind of stuff for underserved, marginalized,
still going strong.
Immigrant communities. Yeah. They ended the teen program probably like mid 2010s. But I was a part of it in 2001 and 2005. Like randomly my mom saw a flyer and was like, listen, I don't know what this is all about, but you be on a computer all the time,
Got you. We found something.
Right. Like here you go. And on top of it,
that's how I started doing karate as a kid.
Yeah.
I was like running around kicking my grandpa and he got mad at me for kicking him. And he like drove past a karate floor and like dropped my ass off one day. And my dad was like, where's Gregory? And grandpa was like, oh, he's in karate class.
He's in karate class because we can't do this anymore. Right. But it's like that program trained me. I went twice a week after school. Every year I completed, I got $1,000 for college. Dang. And then I worked at Microsoft every summer. So they also paired us with the tech companies. So if you imagine if that was maybe like 50 kids a year, right? And I was like part of this program that funneled me into this awesome internship program. I'm not sure at the time how many interns Microsoft took in high school, but I was probably one of the only kids coming from public school and the rest were from private schools, right? And so when I think about how as many locations as Microsoft has in the world, Seattle being one of only that has a high school internship program.
Why?
And I'm like, down the street, I'm going to really try not to curse, but down the street, up the street where there could have been easy pipelines to develop your future software engineers and the Amazons of the world. And it's like, now I look at this and I do criticize. And, full disclosure, Amazon has, has been an advertising partner with me and my business, what have you. But I look at what the opportunity could have been 20 years ago to partner up with schools to create pipelines for these folks. When you look at like the GMs of the world back in the day and the Fords of the world back in the day, you could go straight from high school into a good paying job, buy a home, take care of your family. Right. And somewhere along the line, tech companies refused to do that, specifically within their own backyard. And that today really infuriates me because Microsoft, I think, just is providing this $350 million initiative on affordable housing. 20 years ago, when my friends' grandparents started to lose their homes because they couldn't pay the taxes anymore, it could have been necessary then.
Sure.
Let's not pretend like we didn't know that this was an issue before.
Yep.
So I think that part of the education challenge being the lack of responsibility that corporations have to their own communities and ensuring that, listen, some of these kids will go to STEM, science, high schools, what have you, and they won't go into the field, and that's okay. But the fact that there's a trajectory, it makes that much more of a difference. And if you're a company that hires 5,000 plus people, I think it is completely irresponsible to not say, okay, how do we step into the school district and ensure that the kids in our community and the families in our community have access?
So what's the why and what's the gap? Because you've seen it from both sides, both like personally in Seattle, but then like in your professional experience with education, but then on your other side of the aisle with tech too. And so from, the most well-intentioned will just say, well, the shit's hard. It's hard to make the connections. It's hard to do the pipelines. And from the least well-intentioned will say, well, there's like very intentional decisions of like racism and systemic things happening and reasons why they're not investing those dollars in those neighborhoods or those people. And you've seen both sides. So like, what's the why? And then like, what's the why? Then like, how do we fix it?
I don't know if, and again, like I'm not a history buff, but I think about globalization and I think about the opportunities that globalization has afforded, right? But I think like when we look at, again, like post-industrial, factories leaving, cheaper labor elsewhere, everything was about, and actually Anand Garita Hondas, whose last name I'm butchering, talks a lot about this in Winner Takes All. And
who's just in Charlotte,
recently,
evoking some fires about.
I love him.
What's supposed to happen, and interesting book. Interesting book in perspective, I think, for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, tons of interesting perspective. I don't think not holding companies accountable for being completely neglectful to their own communities. And I'm not talking about like a nice pat on the back, here's a $10,000 check, let's take a picture and put a press release out. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about actually intentionally building up the next crop of talent to ensure the survival and sustainability of, of the workforce in your own backyard. Because all the big grandiose initiatives elsewhere, like that doesn't help us on the ground. Like we look at the city of Charlotte, and it's like you have the biggest banks here, and you mean to tell me that people down the street could not get jobs there? For what the fuck has been happening for the last 30 years? Right. You know what I'm saying? I don't know, again, if it was lack of department efforts or foundation efforts to focus on talent and pipeline development. Somewhere along the line, we stopped training people, which is why we started to overemphasize a college education. Right. Even though we weren't sure if the value of that, it was more about less meritocracy and much more elitism. Yep. So families can afford to.
And now we're almost seeing the shift maybe back to the other end of the spectrum.
I think so,
right?
Because when I look at what I pay in student loans, it's like I don't know that my college degrees are the reason why I got to any of the places I got to.
We just had a conversation yesterday with somebody who's trying to open a trade charter school like woodshop. And like if you think about the quote unquote, if charter schools are innovative or not, what have you, you can have that conversation. Yeah. But to use it to bring back a trade like woodshop for like carpentry jobs and something else happening, like talk about worlds colliding from like 1960 to 2020. Like what the hell's been happening in those 20 years?
Well, because construction and plumbing, like you can't find enough. Yeah. I mean, and you look at like we don't have enough, machine learning talent, but we also don't have enough plumbers to come and fix your stuff. And like we don't know how to fix things anymore, right? Yep. And I think about like my grandfather was in construction for a number of years before he ended up getting a job at like King TV. And I think about the fact that like he rewired his whole house, built a second edition, like has the skill and the moxie to like, he was the one that helped me build all my science projects, right? And then like when I would tap dance back in the day, like I would like, Grandpa, I need you to build me a stage and stairs.
Back in the day or yesterday?
Yesterday, yeah.
Shout out to Instagram for knowing what Sherrell was doing yesterday.
Yes. But I think about, I just think about like the return of not just learning a skill to learn a skill, but obviously it being tied to a job opportunity.
Right.
And so I think, and I think also just dignity. You know, we have downplayed blue collar, working class jobs for so long. And when I think about the way in which, you know, and I'm not sure if this was true for your family, but most of the folks in my family, like from my mom's generation level, like they have degrees. And so I was told, like, you go to school, you get a good job, and what have you. I graduated in the heart of recession. So I had to figure
2008?
out life. 2009.
9.
Yep.
2008 here.
Yep, 2009. I
baby.
So 6 months
A little bit later.
Yeah.
It's graduating from high school then.
Right. So
But it was a real time.
it was a real time.
Right?
And the difference a couple years makes is I graduated, I had my first job right out of college, and 6 months later, like, she had to lay everyone off. And so it was like a lot of freelancing and trying to get back on your feet versus when you graduate and you have continuity in your career and you're not competing against your mom's friends for jobs.
Yeah.
Like,
that's
for
not the story it's supposed to go,
salaries.
right? Because
No.
you graduate, you work hard, you sacrifice, you finally get the
Yeah.
degree, you get the job, and 6 months later, like, you're on your butt, right? Which
You're on
is
your
a tough
butt,
thing.
and you're not building up the wealth that you're supposed to have. And so
Yeah.
now when you look at the reports and what the economists say, like, we're not doing better than the previous generation, we didn't have healthcare. Like, thank God that I was able to stay on my mom's insurance until I was 26.
Right.
But, like, companies weren't giving out healthcare and benefits and things like that. And just the fact that, like, everything was a hustle and a struggle. It was to the point where I was like, why the hell do I live in America? And I can go to a country that has free access to education. It has, you know, free healthcare
Health
that's
insurance,
better.
yeah.
Right. Like, just that alone,
Maternity
that
leave.
could save you.
Paternity
Right.
leave, right.
Maternity, paternity leave.
Right.
Like, you don't have to struggle and fight so hard to just for the basics. So at any event, I think, you know, as it just relates to education, we are rethinking and reframing, but we also have to be very clear that barriers to education are super significant. Had I had a choice to change any part of my story, I would still get these damn degrees. I may have changed the way that I went about them in terms of cost perspective, but I also think about, like, I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, like, I still need those pieces of paper to walk through the doors that I walk through just so that I can be in the room and people don't think I'm a complete idiot. And I think about the barriers, particularly for individuals who do not have the same level of access. Like I said, I started off, like, my first job in high school was Microsoft.
Right.
So I got to...
Which is significant.
Right.
Which is...
Right.
Mine was Wendy's on Sylvania Boulevard. So you...
I mean,
I was a
fries,
hostess.
you got to
I mean,
lift your
shout out to
friends up.
Wendy's. I had to figure it out.
Right,
You know what I mean?
right. But I think about the fact that, like, that set me on a pathway to knowing how to interview in a different kind of way.
Sure.
And it gave me some cultural clout and capital that I've been able to kind of leverage in my experience thus far.
I probably believe that, like, if you're in the high school, like, what does the next step, like, you deserve to be here, I deserve to be here.
That's
and now I
of
know what it looks
entitlement
like.
is
Right.
what I've always walked around with. I was like, no, like, I've done X, Y, and Z. Like, you know, like, you don't want to hire me, that's fine. Like, I'll go elsewhere because I know what my talent is, my worth is. But just imagine, like, if you've never had that experience, you haven't been exposed to what it's like to work for a major company and to get great benefits, to be treated well, to have an HR department where you're not treated well. I just think about, like, education being much more than just, like, the degree, and more so of the totality of your experience, the totality of the network that you have within your neighborhood and within your communities, and the feeling of, like, you know, I don't have to be the smartest person in the room to make a certain amount of money. And I feel like you said, there's a shift. I think there's a shift taking shape, but we also have to be very strategic in terms of how we're building our capital, which is, like, why, like, boot camps and, like, self-paced courses, online learning offer so many different opportunities to get to the same end game, which is being in a career that you love and enjoy, that challenges you and that can adequately provide for you and your family and whatever additional financial goals that you can have in the future.
Well, you said something earlier too that I want to bring back around, like I think in Bridgeport, but maybe now around like the lack, maybe first like the savior mentality of any people in education or like career training, but then like the lack of co-designing or co-creating or like speaking to the stakeholders in which you seek to serve.
Yeah.
Like where is that coming from, and like why is that happening? Where is the lack of like co-designing and co-creating with the people that organizations, schools are really meant to serve?
I think it's arrogance. I think it's, again, like I'm not a researcher on any of these systemic issues, but I will say just like my brief experience sort of being on the other side of the table and then being within the system itself, because I look back at my public school education and, I was in honors and humanities classes. I also had an active parent who, would come down to the school like, no, Sherrell needs to be in this class and this class. And like, the AP offerings and what have you, like I was fortunate and privileged in that end. But when I still look at the quality of my education, particularly in high school, it was still not up to par. Like I got to college and still kind of struggled, and still had some deficits when I looked at my peers who had much more access or a better potentially learning environment. And I think about the fact that like, especially when you are marginalized in this country, you don't really get choice unless you do have some privileges. You don't get to question what your experience is. It just is, and you deal with it. And I think now the co-creation, number one, I think it dignifies people and allows them to have ownership and agency over their experiences. And so I think for the parent organizers, the community organizers, the student organizers who are saying like, listen, there's something missing here and this is what we need. And no, we don't have the money, but if you have the money, then like, let's actually work together to identify like, here are the actual things that we need in order to be successful. Why it doesn't happen, again, I think there's so many different factors that play.
How long do we have to talk about that? Yeah. I mean, and we were just talking yesterday. There's a group, the Family Independence Initiative. Excuse me if I'm getting that wrong, but I think they're a Green Light grantee, which I think most of our listeners maybe Carrie Cook runs Charlotte locally, not from Charlotte, but I think nationally. But their whole model is to give marginalized people or neighborhoods money to navigate the systemic oppression or like the hurdles that they know to be true, because like you cannot co-create, well, you can co-create, but you can't certainly create a whole program in isolation with them in hopes of like supporting the hurdles they're trying to get over without the financial capital to do it. So why don't we just infuse these residents, these communities with the money they haven't maybe rightfully had access to navigate it and just get the hell out of their way. And like the results they're getting from that program is like out of this world.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to like, in technology, there's a lot of like human-centered design conversations, a lot of design thinking. And I think that those principles are starting to make their way into like nonprofit models as well as, again, like I think individuals like really understanding that, hey, like other people have brains about their experience and there's some data that we haven't collected around people and their experiences. And also, is our job to continuously be fighting the good fight, or is our job to work ourselves out of jobs? And if we're trying to work ourselves out of jobs, then we have to do things that help empower people to continue to own their own journey so that you can look back a generation and say, yeah, we solved that. And now, because they were equipped with the right resources, the knowledge, and they were able to leverage that and continue to teach and advocate in their communities, things have drastically improved. And guess what? We don't have to have our fingers in it all the time. We're just here to support and serve as a foundation for when we're asked.
And I think go ahead.
I feel like time's getting away from us, and I feel like we can't leave today without actually talking about what you're doing in Charlotte.
Okay.
Because a lot of it is like, I think maybe in response to your own personal experience, but like creating access for little Sherrell, but also like for others that you've been supporting for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I always hate like talking about myself and things, and I'm trying to work on that.
Should we ask you another question?
No, because I want to talk about the work.
Yeah, well, you deserve to.
Like, yeah, I mean, so like the work and my thinking and idea is, again, like I was empowered and started my journey in technology. And what was great about that experience was I could literally create things from scratch and sort of drive my own narrative. Yep. Whether it was like making websites and selling services from a technical perspective, I really got to show up and do things that had nothing to do with like any self-identifier. It was like, I just have the skill and like I can produce. Yep. And I've always sort of maybe naively thought about like the technology industry as the best space and place for people for it to be this great equalizer. And obviously like as I've learned more and become a little more mature and started to understand, systemic oppression, very, very much realizing like, okay, there's some barriers to entry here and we need to start addressing them. When I moved to Charlotte in 2014 from Bridgeport, again, I started working at Uber as a marketing manager, helping to run the Charlotte market. Eventually went over Google Fiber. One of the most challenging things for me, especially as someone who grew up in a very, very diverse city, coming to Charlotte, like, looking, I'm the nerd. I had about 3 or 4 different cities I was looking at, and I'm like...
So you are an anthropologist. I was like... So maybe a sociologist. You're a low planist.
Maybe. I was just like, I was comparing all kind of different metrics on like which city I would move to, which I thought was going to be most promising, particularly around the areas of like diversity, opportunity for innovation, transportation, because I don't own a car. I've never owned a car. And just kind of like, just new city community. Like,
and why have you never owned a car, real quick? I feel like the people need to know that.
They're really annoying. I went to...
hate owning a car.
It's like you park it and... like you're not using it majority of the time. You have to continuously pay for it.
It's mocking you as it's in the parking lot, just looking at you all day. I feel like
it's healthier not to own a car.
Do you know how many steps I get like when I'm in New York City? Like I instantly lose 10 pounds.
Yeah.
I instantly lose 10 pounds in a month when I moved to New York City. And I went to New York City like right after college, and then, from there it was just like, oh, I can, Uber, I can Lyft, I can, and I'm a big public transit person as well. So for me, it's like there's so many other ways to get around. When I need a car, I rent it, and I'm good.
Will you ever buy one?
If I do, it'll probably be like electric and self-driving.
Tesla. There you go. Yeah.
So
good. All right, sorry.
Yeah. So at any event, anyway, coming into Charlotte, really getting deep into the innovation space. I think part of my challenge when I started to see the startup culture here was it was very homogenous. It was very like white guys and khakis. And I was kind of like, okay, Charlotte is such a diverse city. Like, where the hell is everybody at? And realizing a lot of the networking was very segregated, and that was really awkward. And then I also just didn't see a strong focus and emphasis on skill building, because I was looking for professional development. But I also wanted professional development in an environment with like more women, more people of color, like just whatever. And so some friends and I got together, via Bedford, Frida Hindley and I got together and said like, hey, like what if we created a meetup, call it Black Tech Charlotte, so that it's very explicit. And we are talking about like the future of tech and the future of, Charlotte and tech, and like other folks like us who are, talking about building businesses and working for tech companies or working in a tech capacity. And so that was like end of 2016. It was also like post Keith Lamont Scott murder. And it was also a time in the city where tensions were really high. A lot of things were reactive. And it was hard because, these studies, all the studies that were talked about around lack of economic mobility, and our thinking was we're always sort of, reacting and on the back end. And like, how do we start to be proactive about our experiences? And again, like not waiting for someone to come and save us, but to like take charge and say like, listen, we want to be in an environment where we're talking about moving the city forward without permission. And that first event, like we hosted that at Google Fiber, we had over 125 people that like RSVP'd. Yeah, we thought we were just gonna have like 20, 30 people and like what have you. And that was such a driver. We had kids like coming out of, colleges in Greensboro and like Raleigh who drove up.
There's demand. People wanted it, right?
Yeah, we had private equity investors that came. We had folks who were like about to retire from one of the banks and like, I'm gonna start a cybersecurity, company. And it was just like so dope. And it was so unexpected. So we accidentally created Black Tech Charlotte as this thing, and then decided like, how do we not just create and organize around this idea, but then also create a new narrative, because everything is like poverty porn, right? It's all about like all the poor Black people down the hill aren't getting any resources and this and that. And you look back and you're like, okay, now all these companies and corporations are coming to pretend to be supportive. And it's like, where were y'all 30 years ago? Because you let this happen. So there was no accountability.
Not only let, but maybe like drove it.
Yes.
Can we say that?
Yeah, very specific.
Right.
Very specific. Let's talk about the subprime mortgage crisis.
Right.
Let's talk about who led that.
Yep.
Let's talk about the fake accounts that were created.
Sure.
Like, let's be real. So the pretend checks and the pretend support, to me, it's not impressive. And so, and as you see, I'm extremely passionate about it.
We all should be. Not just should be. It shouldn't be just like the people immediately affected. It should be us as a community of people who see it regardless of skin color or socioeconomic status, because it's affecting all of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But let me take that back. Like, affecting some more than others, to be clear, but at a macro level, not a good look for any human.
But part of the story that wasn't being told, and I think was extremely irresponsible on the behalf of media as well as the city itself, was that there was such an interesting, talent pool of Black and brown and female technologists, and they weren't being looked at. They weren't being served. They weren't being counted. They weren't being interviewed. Their stories weren't being told about what they were doing and building. And I thought that was highly irresponsible. And so for Black Tech Charlotte, our idea was like changing the narrative, because again, everything was on this like economic mobility study and challenge, which was just like, it got pimped so much. Right. And all of these fake initiatives took place and took shape, and nothing actually like came out of that I think to the degree was necessary. Again, I'll discontinue my critique there.
No,
but
it's real.
But when I look at like, well, what is working? You know, who are these people coming out of these like historically Black colleges and universities and computer sciences and machine learning and data science? What are they building? Why aren't we having that conversation? Why aren't the local media folks like talking about that? And we built up a database of 2,000 plus Black technologists and entrepreneurs and people who were like, I'm building an enterprise company. I can't get funding. I can't get recognition in this city. And it was a challenge because Black Tech Charlotte's not a nonprofit. I'll say that, right away. We're not a nonprofit.
And you're intentional about, from what we know, what you should be intentional because of some of the things we talk about.
Because, when potential funders or potential partners sat across the table from us, they're like, well, why aren't you a nonprofit? And I'm like, well, that in and of itself, again, is like a racist question, because why should you make money building out an initiative, that is geared towards the development of Black and brown talent? Why are you not a nonprofit? And it's like, and for me, it was honestly, it really wasn't about being anti-nonprofit. It was just like, number one, we're building something, we're not sure what it is yet. I don't want to go around creating a board unless someone's going to give me a check for a couple $1 million to get started. Like, I don't want to go and beg people for money. I'd rather create value and develop a pipeline and, figure this thing out first. And maybe on the back end, we can create some kind of foundational aspect.
I think there's real practicality to that, because like, folks that some know, some don't, but like when you're opening a nonprofit, you wait, you got to file, you got to build a board. Like, it slows the process down of waiting for permission to do it. Like, let's just get to town and do it.
We waited for no permission.
And there's I think wrong narratives around like what it means to be a nonprofit or a for-profit, and like it's a tax advantage, right? But like some organizations, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, are still doing just as good as work as anybody else.
Absolutely. And like I said, coming from startup land where we were taught to move fast, break things, it was like, no, let's just go. Let's see what this is. We didn't know what it was yet. And then we just created this whole mass, and they were like, oh, and then we can do this and we can do this, and we can partner with folks like, Flatiron and, help people get access to tech training. Right. And make it happen. And so, again, it was not waiting for permission. And then it was also not allowing people to demean us with language. Language shapes everything. We talk about education, but I don't think we talk enough about like language. If every single conversation is describing people as low income, underserved, underrepresented, at risk, blah, 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 like your experience with people who are other, if those are all the negative words that you're using to describe people, it gives no nuance and no dimensionality. And it also doesn't treat people as assets.
And I think what we've seen too is like those are often words not used by the people in which they are trying to serve. Right. And so like from like the savior complex or from like bringing change to a community, those
Yep.
words are not common words that they would use on their own. So like, why are other people using them to describe them, or their agency?
But you got to
as a human?
understand, like, you know, again, people thinking Black Tech Charlotte as a nonprofit, which is a fine mistake to make.
Sure.
But I think also weaponizing the language to marginalize us.
Mm-hmm.
And I've literally had to tell people to kick rocks, and not in those words, but in other kinds of words.
Yeah.
And also,
I'm a big supporter of the phrase "kick rock," so I think we can use
Yeah.
it as much as you want.
Chuckling
yeah.
about that
And also to remind people when they are partnering with us, they're making an investment in the asset that is a pipeline of talent that we want to stay in Charlotte,
Yep.
to grow their businesses, to build their families here, to continue to contribute to the economic outcomes here in the city, because we have seen people say like, look, I'm out. You know, I'm going to go take this job at Twitter in, you know, San Francisco, or I'm going to go here, I'm going to go here.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've cultivated, you know, bringing venture capitalists from places like Google Ventures, Catalyst Ventures,
Yep.
Impact America Fund. You know, we've brought out, you know, Airbnb. We've brought out a lot of different companies into the city specifically to meet with Black talent and Black tech talent.
Yep.
We've organized around that. And again, like with the language of this is talent, you know, in a way that a lot of folks do not refer to people that look like me.
Right.
It's always a charity case versus no, we're the baddest, you know, in the crew. And like I said, when I tell people kick rocks, I'm like, between me and my team, we have MBAs, Ivy League degrees, corporate experience. We've done a lot more than some of the folks who do get to be empowered around this technology conversation. We've actually have experience with tech companies on a national and international scale.
Yep.
And have built things with our bare hands and gotten investment dollars and have raised money and have been like hyper revenue focused. And so the expertise of our team has far outweighed the way that we've actually been treated, if I'm being completely honest.
Sure.
But I stick closer to the mission than versus I think the noise, and the mission again being, you know, the folks in Charlotte, the stories that we get, the people that come, you know, through our digital doors and attend every single event, like, you know, for Innovation Week, our event around coding and careers, and, you know, career coaching on like, how do you land that next job? How do you polish up your resume? How do you polish up your LinkedIn profile? What's going to be necessary as you're entering these really highly technical interviews? You know, our biggest thing is like tactical, strategic.
Implementation.
And implementation
Execution.
and being a support, helping people to navigate and get to that next opportunity, particularly as we talk about innovation in this city.
Right. All right, we're gonna wrap. We know you got to go, but I think hopefully the listening audience can at least listen and hear and see like why Sherrell is such an inspiration to so many people, but to me personally too, for creating the space for holding everybody accountable, regardless of race, regardless of background, and focusing on execution the way it needs to for all communities. So thank you. We're going to get you out with some more quick questions, can we? Maybe
Quick.
fun, maybe quick. We'll see.
Sure.
One thing we should do or the listening audience should do that would actually make change.
Oh, those are all the good things. I think kind of going back to the nonprofit conversation, I think there's some incredible people, incredible organizations. There's the Stiletto Boss Project that's teaching.
Just talking about them this morning.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah.
Shout out to SBU.
Yes. Ginia, you know, Massey has some incredible programs teaching young girls, you know, across CMS, I believe, you know, about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking. You have, you know, Marsha Barnes from the Finance Bar locally, who has just been doing some incredible work around
Crushing
financial
the game.
literacy and
Follow her
education.
on Instagram and Twitter and everything.
Yeah, I think supporting Black women entrepreneurs in this city is hypercritical. I don't think we've all been able to feel the weight of actually being supported. I'm not talking about hand claps and, you know, a trophy every now and again, but I'm talking about actual dollars and investment.
Real support. Yep.
I think real support matters. And so if you come across or follow or, you know, engage with a company or an organization that is, you know, run by a Black woman in the city of Charlotte, support or garner resources or make connections and, you know, continue to make those investments.
All right, last question. What does Square Pizza remind you of?
You know, this was such a hard question because I order flat crust pizza
See,
a
it's
lot.
provoking the best answers. The podcast might just be talking about square pizza the entire time.
It makes me so happy. Like, they cut the pizza up into all these, like, because they don't cut it like a regular pizza. Right. They cut it like down the center and down the middle, and then you have these really cool square pieces of pizza, and then you can eat it.
It's more approachable.
Yeah. It's so much more approachable.
I feel like you can eat more pizza when it's square.
And I do.
Right.
And that's the problem. However,
Is it a problem?
I enjoy it.
Is it a problem?
Thank you all for having me. Really
Thank y'all so
appreciate
much. We'll put all the good links, the things to check out Sherrell and her dope work in the show notes.
Sweet.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, guys, this is Greg. Thanks again for checking out the podcast episode. Feel free to show us some love on social media. So Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, at Shermco, SCHERMCO, and hashtag Square Pizza Pod. Would love to see your reviews and connect with you there. Stay in touch for the next episode.